Hello, welcome to a small tutorial just showing the differences and what the general layout of Rhino is. Um, it's fairly straightforward for the most part. Rhino works like a lot of other 3D modelers, at least ones that have multiple viewports. What you're looking at is just the base small project inches file. Um, Most of your tools and everything that you're going to find here are located up here at the top in any of these different tabs or here on the side. Obviously, this main area is the viewport. Over to the right, you have some more options and other ways to kind of interact with how, in this circumstance, display is shown, but things like object properties and layers. Then at the bottom, you have some of more of your control interface items, things like grid snap, whether you want to draw orthogonally, whether you only want planar drawing, the O-snap tool or the gumball tools. Those are all located down here. For many of you, if you're used to working in Revit or some other 3D modelers, you may only be used to looking at a perspective mode. Here we have a top, front, perspective, and right. You can change these by just going here and clicking in, going to set view to different ones. But if you only want to view one of these, just double click on it and it will pop up the whole way. You can see that there are tabs down at the bottom left of what the other views are, as well as a plus sign where you can kind of add views and things. Oftentimes I use the perspective tool to do most of my work, just because it's what I'm most familiar with and I can kind of understand it a bit more spatially. But sometimes if you're working in plan mode, top view is very useful, or in elevation, front or right is. So the basic layout is going to just be tools over here, more extended properties here, and then interface stuff down here. You also have a handful of things up here at the top. Those are kind of situational. You might not even have some, depending on if you have certain plugins or things installed. Also, if your colors are slightly different from mine, that's fine. You can customize all that. I generally run with a darker screen because it's easier on my eyes. But everything here should look basically the same. The first thing I want to show you is how to make something simple. We're going to go with a line. I primarily work in the command line, so that's going to be this area up here. If you've used AutoCAD, you've probably gotten familiar with working with the command line interface. If I just type in the word line, it's going to give me a whole set of things that have the word line in it. I want just a normal line. And it will tell me what I'm supposed to do at each step of the way. So it's asking for the start of the line. For the most part, it's going to draw on the construction plane, which is right now just your XY. And then you can kind of see that we're on a grid right now, but it's not snapping to anything. We can just kind of move it wherever we want to go. We'll just go with a line like that. You can select this line. You can even select the specific endpoints to change certain things. Probably most similar to Illustrator for some of you, but it's pretty easy to navigate. In order to zoom in and out, I'm using the scroll wheel on my mouse. In order to rotate around, I'm holding the right mouse button. And then if I want to pan, I'm going to hold shift and then right click, and then I will be able to pan to different directions. We'll get into other more complicated ways to set your view in a little bit. You'll notice that I can't move this. I can kind of move this whole thing, but it's kind of floaty. It's very imprecise. Generally, if you're trying to move things very precisely within Rhino, you're going to want to use a command for that, similar in Revit, where you would just type MV for the shortcut. Here, you're just going to type in move and then hit enter. And you'll notice that it's not really grabbing onto anything. It's just kind of floating in the air. What I'm essentially doing is I'm moving it based on where my start point is and where my end point is. So you don't have to click on the object to move it. You can just move it any way you want to. One thing I'm going to do is I'm going to hold shift. You'll notice that this starts to lock it into one of the orthogonal directions. That's a really handy tool. I'm still holding shift. I'm going to hit tab. And you'll see that turned white. that's basically locked it in a certain direction. This is often my go-to for moving things, is holding shift and tab to start moving things orthogonally, or using tab to lock something into a different direction. If I hit tab again, you'll notice that the distance is fixed, but now it's rotating it around. So it kind of gives you a way to like declare what angle you're going to. And if you hit tab a third time, it's just going to get rid of both of those and go back to the original way it was working. If, say, you need it to go in a certain direction, so say we look from above and we need it to go this direction, but you don't know exactly how far it is, but you know it needs to be in that angle. So say if you're trying to match an angle to another piece in your environment, you can hit tab now and it'll lock it. It doesn't have to be orthogonal. It's just more useful in orthogonal, in my opinion. Same thing. If you hit tab again, it'll move to this. And if you hit tab the third time, it turns that off. This is how I'm often going to be moving things. So as you watch my videos, just be aware that that's the process I'm using to move things. We're going to go ahead and just move it. Other things that I almost always have turned on are OSnap, which is this thing down here at the bottom. It gives you access to all of these different checkboxes. These are basically things that you can snap onto. If you're used to having to turn on and turn off snapping in Photoshop, it's the same thing. You just get to control what things you can snap to. In this case, end points of objects. Near would be like to edges and other things that aren't necessarily points, but you're close to it. It'll kind of ride along the line. Point objects themselves, midpoints, center points, intersections between two different things, things that are perpendicular. So if you try to draw a line from here, it'll go in the perpendicular direction. Tangents, quads, knots. All these are a little bit more complicated once you start getting into the actual base geometry that Rhino is using, but they can be very useful for different reasons. I have a lot of them checked almost always. I kind of don't uncheck them unless they're getting in the way. Your mileage may vary a little bit on that, but I find it very helpful and much quicker to be able to move things to other things. So I'm going to make another line, just like that. And say I want to move this one so that this end touches to that end. So from here to there, just type in move. So it's kind of locked on, and you'll see it's like kind of like, it'll spit out like different lines and stuff like orthogonally. Now I'm going to go ahead and click on the end point there, and it told me it was on the end, and I'm going to put it on this end here. And so now those are connected at the ends. If I wanted to join those, I would start making what is called a polyline. The other thing I often use is a tool called the gumball. So if I click on this, nothing here has changed. You don't get like another menu to have to like hit anything on, but when you click on something, you now get this thing. It scales with your viewport, so like if it looks like it's covering up your whole thing, if you scale in, it will get smaller while the object will get larger. It is basically how you would move things, in my experience, in like a 3D slicing software. So if you're using like Prusa or Cura, you've often seen something like this, where you have just one specific angle here, that are like orthogonal direction here. You have potentially planes that you can move on. So you see that this is red and this is blue. Generally, unless you've changed those colors. This will allow you to move within this one single plane. So you'll notice if I come over here, it's not shooting off that direction so much. It's all kind of in one plane. I'm going to hit Control Z to undo. Oftentimes, whenever I'm drawing, I will just keep things kind of in the plan like this and use this one to move things around to make sure that I'm not moving them up or down off of that construction plane. You do also have these different scalars here. So if I hold this one, it will scale it in this direction, kind of squashes and stretches it. As well as these little handles, which allow you to do certain types of extrusions. So this is now a full shape, full surface. And if I extrude this upwards, it's a 3D object. We'll get into why you're not seeing shading and stuff on that in just a second. And if I go all the way back, you'll see that I have these couple of angles here, or these rotational degrees, and they do exactly that. They're just rotational. And you can hold things like shift to like lock them into the 90, 180, 270 degree positions as well. Finally, if you want to use one of these, but you want to move it more precisely, say I want to move it to the right like 2 inches. You can just click on it and it'll bring up a little dialog, and you can just type in 2, and it's pretty easy. Generally, when I'm just trying to figure out what I'm doing, I use these tools in order to map out and kind of get a basic idea, and to essentially sketch with this program in a 3D space. It's not exactly the same, but it's close enough. So now I mentioned before that whenever I extruded something this way and this way, I'm extruding the same thing, and instead of extruding the whole thing, you can kind of see that it is a box. Like, it does exist in 3D space. It does get perspective and everything to it, but like you can see the other side to it. This is actually a solid object. If I change my view type to shaded, right now it's on a wireframe, which is the default, you'll see that it is a fully 3D object. So similarly, just to show you what this process looked like from here. So it made that surface. I select that surface. Oftentimes I will run inside of the shaded view just like this. I tend not to use the wireframe unless I'm really dealing with lots of information or I'm just doing line drawings. Occasionally it can be useful if I need to pull information from further back, but there's a tendency that if you're snapping onto things, things will snap way beyond, while here, if you try to snap onto something, so say I make a line here, and then I move it, I'm not snapping onto the edge or anything of this box behind it. It does block it, so it blocks that snap. It does have some idea that if you can't see it, you're probably not going to want to snap or adhere to it. All right, so that's a very basic overview of how this works. There are a lot of other views here. Rendered is going to be much more in a kind of clay rendering, or if you start putting materials on things, it'll start rendering it here. There's a secondary render called ray trace, which uses your graphics card, and it is much more like a traditional renderer. Of course, there are other things like pen, which is mostly this kind of more, it's a little bit more SketchUp-y, where it has silhouette lines, or Arctic, where everything gets turned white, or X-ray, which I do find somewhat useful because you do get some of the shading, but you do get to see beyond it. Ghosted is similar, where you can kind of control that transparency. You can make things more or less opaque, but generally, shaded is probably where you're going to be operating unless you're dealing with really large amounts of data or you're trying to set something up for a render. So that gets you most of the different view types. We're going to end the video here since this has basically gotten you used to where things generally are. My next video, I'm going to talk about essentially what these tools are, go through a basic overview. I will not be able to talk about them all. And then the video after that, we're going to talk about the grasshopper stuff. Thank you.